Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
Versailles was the authoritarian ideal, splendid yet regimented. But there were also those who looked beyond the rules of absolutism to the rules of nature and the rights of man. Absolutism and the social contract, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Around 1700, Europe lives between two poles of attraction, England and France. Two kinds of culture, two models of what society and government should be like, more or less autocratic, more or less disciplined, more or less orderly. And the two contrasting systems compete at every level, for world power, of course, but also for cultural dominion. It was the tug of war between French barracks and English counting house, between informal English gardens and formal French parks, between hunger riots in France and political riots in England. And to start with, the contest seems one-sided because through most of the 18th century, French cultural dominance seems to match French political preponderance. And as with Corneille, the influence of Versailles had seeped into the habits of polite society. First, it was fashions in clothes, in food and entertainment. Then it was fashions in behavior. The rulers of Russia and Poland and Germany kept correspondence to tell them what the latest rules of etiquette were at the French court. Just because Versailles was so splendid did not mean, however, that it was also gay. It was regimented, monotonous, uncomfortable. Everyone and everything had their assigned part to play in the perfectly ordered, perfectly regulated whole. The anarchic individualism of an earlier time was banished. In art, as in court ritual, individual works of art lost their individuality. They became parts of a great monumental decoration. Versailles was in effect an authoritarian ideal, with its discipline, its tight, impressive structure, its censorship, its limitations. Outside this artificial structure, you were not supposed to explore, because exploration and experimentation outside set limits might produce change. And the great object of classical France in the 17th century was to avoid change, because change could unbalance the existing state of affairs. All the curiosities of the human mind had to be guarded against. They were not only dangerous, they were also foolish. Pascal, who was probably the greatest mind of 17th century France, Pascal declared that all the troubles of men came from the fact that they wouldn't stay quietly at home in their own room and make the most of what they had. Of course, Pascal was talking about faith and the privacy in which you could best come to terms with your own spirituality and with God. Even so, This was the thinking of men who had a room of their own to stay in. It was the point of view of satisfied men in a satisfied society whose supreme concern was to preserve stability and the status quo. And this was the essence of the classical spirit. It loved stability. It was the calm after the storm of the Renaissance and the Reformation, after those great tidal waves of movement and questioning and adventure. Now was the time for rest and meditation. Time to stop criticizing, time to stop wanting a change. And so politics, religion, society, and art were withdrawn from all the discussions of the past 2 centuries. The ship of humanity had come to port at last, and all wise men wished that it would stay there forever. Everything had fallen into place. Everything was perfect and perfectly ordered. Why should men risk experiments? Why should they risk speculations which might unsettle everything once more? Of course, you can't keep the world from turning. One man's perfection is another man's anachronism. And so absolutism carried the seeds of its own dissolution. It reflected the triumph of secular values over spiritual ones, the triumph of modern government over feudalism, and that didn't just mean the triumph of the crown, but the triumph of the counting house as well, which was going to bring change whether the crown liked it or not, and which was going to weigh the balance from the French model back to the English model. Absolute government was supposed to make not only strong nations, but also wealthy nations. 17th century economic doctrine said that it would achieve this by government regulation of the national economy to augment the power of the state at the expense of its rivals. This is the doctrine we call mercantilism. In mercantilism, a country's wealth lies in its stock of gold and silver. You have to gather in all the gold and silver you can, and you have to develop national industry so that your country can sell as much as possible abroad and buy as little as possible from abroad. That way, bullion flows in, not out, and the country is supposed to be stronger. National industries, however, have to be protected against foreign competition, so mercantilism is both nationalist and protectionist. In the Netherlands, trading companies like the East India Company had been created by free enterprise. But in France and Italy and Central Europe, it would be the state which founded ports like Brest, which encouraged trading companies and merchantmen to pursue what Colbert called a peaceful war. At first, businessmen were going to welcome this, but as they grew stronger, they began to change their minds. Commercial capital doesn't mind state investment, but it doesn't want state control, and the mercantilist state classically tells business what to do, as Louis XIV tells the French Council of Business here. In due course, however, business wanted a say in how the state was run. At the same time, business values began to affect the way people thought about law and society. In this view, law was a practical matter separate from religion, while politics had nothing to do with theology. These practical gentlemen are Dutch magistrates as painted by Rembrandt. The 17th century didn't find the rules of human society in some divine revelation. It studied nature and it studied man. Man has will, he can affect his destiny, he doesn't necessarily have to obey the will of others. He may seek his own satisfaction and happiness, which implies the rights of man. Furthermore, he is endowed with certain faculties, which means that he is supposed to use these faculties. And nature has made him gregarious and sociable. He wants to live in society, which means he has a social consciousness. It means that he is capable of social responsibility. This is the vital unwritten rule that nature has engraved on the heart of man. Or so argued a Dutch jurist named Hugo Grotius, who would provide the basis of international law as we think of it today. This idea of society being the outcome of natural tendencies was going to be carried still further. The reasoning went this way. Men have a natural inclination to live in orderly and peaceful societies. Law grows out of their social instinct. They come together and they make a deal, a contract. They agree to defend property against trespass. They agree to submit to a common authority. And so we imagine that society begins with a contract between men, and then a second contract between men and someone to rule over them and protect them. And that is the social contract. In 17th century Europe, people wanted a strong power that would defend order and peace and force commercial expansion. And so they favored, or at least they accepted, absolute monarchy. But if they should decide that order and peace and trade would do better under some other regime, then they were likely to change their minds, which is exactly what happened in England, where the historic political revolutions of the 17th century took place, and where the political theories were worked out to justify them. In England, as you recall, Queen Elizabeth had confirmed the Protestant settlement of her father Henry VIII. And when Elizabeth died in 1603, she was succeeded by her nearest Protestant relative, the King of Scotland, James VI, who came to rule in England as James I. The King James Bible, by the way, is named after him. James's son was Charles I, and Charles had some of the tendencies of Richelieu and Louis XIV, whose aunt he married. He didn't like competing authorities. He tried to govern and raise taxes without parliament, to unify and control the church. He wanted, in other words, to be an absolute king. But unlike Louis XIV, he failed. Religious troubles in Scotland, colonial problems in Ireland, political and religious complications in England all raised a hornet's nest about Charles's ears. Parliament wouldn't vote to pay taxes to support his armed forces because if the king's military power was too great, he could force Parliament to vote the way he wanted. He could force Parliament to pay the taxes even if it hadn't voted for them. In 1642, Charles attempted to arrest 5 leaders of the House of Commons and then declared war on Parliament. Thus began the English Civil War, the major battles of which are depicted in this 18th century print. The war lasted for 7 years, and it saw the annihilation of the royal army and Charles's surrender. After continuing to intrigue against Parliament even after his defeat, Charles was tried and executed in 1649. The brief Republican interlude that followed under Oliver Cromwell didn't work out too well. when Parliament entertained a motion to disband Cromwell's army, an army that had grown very powerful after its conquest of Scotland and Ireland, Cromwell retaliated by disbanding Parliament, and he ruled thereafter as Lord Protector. When Cromwell died in 1658, the Stuarts were restored under Charles II. Until, that is, another revolution by Parliament, the Glorious Revolution, so called because it was almost bloodless. It swept out Charles's successor, James II, in 1688, and it placed on the throne a Dutchman, the Prince of Orange, whom history knows as William III. This is a contemporary Dutch print showing William arriving in England. So, by the end of the 17th century, the absolute power of the crown had been broken and the contest for supremacy had ended in a sort of partnership between Parliament and the King, competitive to begin with and fraught with tension, but settling down eventually to a parliamentary monarchy. Each of England's two revolutions was also going to inspire a great work of political thought. In 1651, 2 years after the execution of Charles I, Thomas Hobbes published Leviathan, and John Locke published his treatise on civil government in 1688, the year of the Glorious Revolution. Hobbes's book, Leviathan, which incidentally he wrote while in exile in Paris, Leviathan took the current theories about nature and human nature and turned them on their head. Mankind, said Hobbes, is naturally wicked. Man is not a social being, he's a purely selfish creature, always seeking his own advantage. There are no higher aims. There is no good except pleasure. There is no evil except pain. There is no freedom beside the freedom to follow your passions. The basic principle of life is selfishness, said Hobbes. And with everybody struggling to get what they want, the natural state of man is what Hobbes calls a state of war, a constant struggle of man against man. And in this unregenerate state of nature, people live in continual fear, and their lives, said Hobbes in a famous phrase, are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So if we don't want the human race to kill itself off, we have to introduce an artificial remedy, which is power. Instead of the basic equality of humans, we now introduce a regime of inequality, the only thing that can save them from the destruction and discomfort that free men inflict on each other. In other words, we set up a political society under the authority of a monarch who necessarily has to be absolute. It's no use talking about social contracts, said Hobbes, because men won't keep any contract. The only thing that can repress their savage instincts is force and the fear that force inspires. So the absolute king must have the power of arms and also the power to settle disputes which we call justice. And since you cannot reconcile liberty and life, because the pursuit of liberty leads to anarchy and loss of life, it's better to choose life, because without life, liberty isn't much use. And however arbitrary and unpleasant this may be, it's still better than the savage freedom of catch as catch can from which it preserves us. So, Hobbes' state is in fact a Leviathan, an enormous, monstrous machine which takes the place of natural society. Now you have to understand that Hobbes defended absolute power not because of some divine right, but in the name of the interest of ordinary people who needed security and peace in order to live and enjoy life. So he wasn't interested in the majesty of power, but in its utility. His absolute ruler had to deliver. He was judged by his success in providing not justice or virtue, but peace and prosperity, which is pretty much how many of us judge our own rulers, whether we admit it or not. Still, Hobbes has always shocked respectable people. Fortunately, respectable people were going to get a philosopher after their own heart in John Locke. Locke, who sailed to England with William of Orange, had just produced a theory that could be used to justify England's removal of its previous king, James II, king by the grace of God. He had set out to prove the right of a subject to rebel against his sovereign.
Locke, too, started out from the state of nature, but he disagreed with Hobbes. The state of nature is simply imperfect, said Locke. To remedy its imperfections, men get together and they agree on a social contract. This contract is concluded among men for their own advantage, and it implies playing the game of social living by definitely established rules. If anybody breaks these rules, he's outlawed. And if it is the ruler who breaks the rules, then any member of society, and of course society as a whole, has the right to appeal to the rules which had been agreed on, and if necessary, has the right to appeal to them by force. And Locke's conclusion was simple. If the executive power does not act according to the ends for which it has been set up, if it infringes on the liberties of the people, then this power must be removed from the hands of whoever holds it. And in fact, if the people have reason to suspect that the would-be tyrant is preparing the means to enslave them, they have the right, by natural law, to take preventive action and by open rebellion to keep him from carrying out his plans.
So John Locke had not only justified the glorious revolution, he had also produced the concept of a natural man, on the whole decent enough and civilized enough to come to terms with himself and behaving according to natural law. This idea of natural law and Locke's conception of man as naturally decent came to form the essence and the base of the new English legal and constitutional thought. Natural law also entered into the politics of its time, and particularly into the politics of England, whose success would influence the rest of the world from then on. Moreover, it marked an alliance with Protestantism, influencing it so much that gradually and increasingly the conception of man's fall from grace was abandoned in favor of a new idea of perfectibility, man's perfectibility and society's perfectibility by man.
Above all, natural law meant that men could now see that divine right, as soon as it pretended to establish the absolute rule of a man, as shown here, or a regime. Divine right was not supernatural, it was anti-natural, and as such to be scorned and attacked. Now this, of course, was only the beginning. The development and the diffusion of all these ideas has gone on to our own day, but the 17th century marked a decisive stage because the theory of natural right, the theory of the rights of man, and finally the reality of hard facts
had at last been joined together in the glorious revolution of 1688 and in the ideas and in the institutions arising out of it. Locke was less vigorous than Grotius, he was more superficial than Hobbes, but he was the right man at the right time. He was responsible for the secularization of political theory and of legal theory. He was responsible for the divorce between reason and mystery, and for the relegation of divine intervention to where it belonged, in heaven, far removed from the realities of worldly affairs. And we might fairly take this passage from Locke's essay on civil government as marking both his purpose and his significance to us. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. The following century was going to write the concrete epilogue of these words.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.